Welcome to The Distance, an audiobook short story. Chapter 1. The Choice. The odometer rolled past another number Joseph didn't read. He'd stopped reading numbers somewhere outside Fort Stockton when the last gas station fell behind him and the highway narrowed to 2 lanes with nothing on either side but scrub and sky. The RV hummed under him, a good sound, a working sound. He kept both hands on the wheel the way he'd kept them on every wheel for 30 years, and he watched the white line unspool toward a horizon that never got closer. This was what he knew, the going, not the arriving. Creosote bushes blurred past, gray-green and low, spaced like someone had planted them on purpose and then walked away. A hawk hung over the road, wings fixed, riding something Joseph couldn't see. He'd been driving since first light, and the dashboard clock said it was past 4. He hadn't passed a car in an hour.
The thought arrived without weight. He turned it over. An hour. On the routes back home there was always something. A sedan, a school bus, a kid on a bike who didn't look both ways. Connection, all day long. Packages handed across thresholds. Sign here, a nod, the door closing.
Out here, the door was the whole world, and it stood wide open. The engine knocked. Once. A single hard sound, metal on metal, deep in the front of the RV. Joseph's foot lifted off the gas before his mind caught up.
"What?" he said. To the dashboard, to the gauges that still read fine.
The engine knocked again, then settled into a grinding rhythm, and the steering wheel began to shudder in his hands. He eased toward the shoulder. Gravel popped under the tires. A plume of steam curled up from the seam of the hood, thin and white, and then thicker, and the temperature needle swung hard to the right, like it had been waiting all day for the chance. He killed the ignition. The silence came down so fast it had a sound of its own. Joseph sat there with his hands still on the wheel. Outside the windshield, the road ran straight ahead and straight behind, and the steam climbed and thinned and vanished into a sky the color of a struck match. No wind, no birds now. Just the tick of cooling metal and his own breath, which he could hear, which he never heard. He let go of the wheel, and his fingers ached.
"Okay," he said. "Okay."
He climbed out. The heat hit him like opening an oven, dry and total, and the gravel crunched under his boots loud enough to make him flinch. He walked to the front and popped the hood. A wall of heat and the smell of scorched oil rolled up into his face, and he stepped back, coughing, waving it off.
He didn't know engines. He knew roots. He knew the difference between a porch with a dog and a porch without one. Knew which neighborhoods tipped at Christmas and which ones never opened the blinds. He knew people's habits better than they did.
He didn't know what made an engine knock like that and then quit. He leaned in anyway, reached down and touched something hot and jerked his hand back. A line had split somewhere. He could see fluid, dark and slow, dripping onto the gravel and disappearing into it. The desert took it. He pulled his phone from his pocket. His thumb knew the motions. The screen lit. He held it up and watched the bars in the corner. Nothing. He turned, faced down the road, then back, then out at the open scrubland, holding the phone over his head like it might catch something that drifted past. No service. He walked 10 steps up the highway, held it up. No service. He walked back, past the RV, 20 steps the other way, into the heat shimmer that pooled on the asphalt and made the far distance swim. No service. No service. No service.
Come on. He shook it, which he knew did nothing. Come on.
The screen stared back, indifferent as the sky.
Joseph lowered his arm. He stood in the middle of the empty highway and turned a slow circle, and there was nothing. No town, no tower, no power line marching off toward some distant somewhere. Just the road and the scrub and a low ridge of brown hills to the west going gold at their tops where the sun had started to drop. The light was changing. He could feel the heat losing its edge, the first hint that this place got cold when the sun let go. He'd left at first light 2 days prior because Sarah worked the morning shift and he hadn't wanted to be there when she got back. Hadn't wanted the conversation. The one where she'd stand in the doorway with her keys still in her hand and look at him loading the RV and ask, in that careful voice she'd learned to use, "Where are you going, Joe?"
He'd packed in the dark to avoid the careful voice. And now here he was, in the dark soon enough, with a dead engine and a dead phone, and no careful voice anywhere for 100 miles. He laughed. It came out wrong, more breath than sound, and he put his hand over his mouth like he could push it back in. He went back to the step of the RV and sat down. The metal had cooled. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the road. A car would come. That was what he told himself. People drove this road. Somebody drove every road, eventually. He'd sit here, and a truck would come over that rise, and the driver would slow, and Joseph would stand up and lift his hand, and the whole thing would fix itself the way things fix themselves when you waited long enough for someone else to come along. He'd spent his life waiting for the door to open. The sun dropped another notch. The gold on the hills slid down toward the base, and the sky over the eastern flats went from match flame to something deeper, a blue with weight in it. And the first thing Joseph noticed about the silence was that it had stopped feeling empty and started feeling full. Like the desert was holding its breath. Like it was watching him sit there waiting for a door. No car came. He watched the rise to the east where the road came in. Nothing crested it. He watched until his eyes burned from not blinking, and the light kept failing, and the air kept cooling, and the gravel beside the RV had gone the color of ash.
He thought about Sarah's face. Not the careful one, the other one, from before, from years back, the night in the kitchen when she'd put both hands flat on the table and said,
"I feel like I'm married to a man hiding behind glass."
He hadn't answered. He'd looked at the table where her hands were and waited for the moment to pass, because that was what he did. He waited for moments to pass. He let things go quiet until they went away.
She'd waited too, that night, longer than he'd thought she would. And then she'd taken her hands off the table and gone to bed, and he'd sat there in the kitchen alone, relieved, telling himself he'd kept the peace. The peace. Joseph pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. Out here, there was nothing to wait out, no moment to let pass. The silence wasn't going to get up and go to bed. It would still be here in an hour, in the dark, and tomorrow when the heat came back, and there was no glass to hide behind, because there was no one on the other side of it.
He could fix this. He turned the thought over the way he'd turned over the silence an hour ago, looking for the working part of it. He could walk west the way he'd been going until the bars came back. Could be 5 miles, could be 50. He had water for a day, maybe 2 if he was careful, and a body that had spent 30 years sitting in a variety of vehicles.
Or he could stay, sit on this step and wait for someone to come along. His whole life he'd chosen the thing that let someone else decide. He'd let Sarah decide they were fine when they weren't. He'd let the route decide where he went and when he came home. He'd let the silence decide what got said and what got swallowed. The first star came out. He didn't see it arrive. He looked up and it was there, low in the east over the dark flats, bright and steady and alone, and Joseph stared at it and felt something turn over in his chest that he had no name for. He could stay still. Not the staying of a man waiting to be rescued. A different staying. The kind that meant he stopped for once and didn't run and didn't wait for the moment to pass and sat inside his own life with the door wide open and nobody coming. The thought frightened him more than the dead engine, more than the dead phone, more than the cold coming down or the miles in every direction. He wasn't ready for it.
He stood up, his right knee cracked. He looked down the road one last time, east, at the rise where no headlights showed, and he made himself a small promise that was really just a delay. He'd decide in the morning. Walk or wait, run or stay. In the morning, when he could see.
The star held its place over the flats. Above it, while he watched, a second one came clear, and then a third, and the sky kept giving them up one at a time, like it had all the time in the world, and knew that he did too. Joseph climbed inside the dark RV and pulled the door shut behind him. Chapter 2. The Trouble. Morning came gray, and then gold, and then white, the heat climbing back through the thin walls of the RV before Joseph had finished his first bottle of water. He'd slept in his clothes. He sat up on the narrow bed, his back stiff, his mouth dry, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. Then the silence reminded him. He made a plan. A courier made a plan. You looked at the day and you broke it into stops, and you took the stops one at a time, and at the end there was a depot and a clock you punched. Stop 1. Water. He counted the bottles wrapped in plastic in the cabinet under the sink. 21 bottles remained. He'd bought them at the Walmart in Fort Stockton. Now he stood there doing the math he should have done yesterday. A gallon a day in this heat, more if he walked. 3 days. 4 if he stayed in the shade and didn't sweat. He drank only a little bit to make it last. Stop 2. The engine. He propped the hood and looked at it in the daylight, and the daylight didn't help. The split line had stopped dripping. The fluid was gone, soaked into the gravel and dried to a dark stain. He found the toolbox he'd thrown in the back, and he leaned in over the engine with a wrench in his hand and turned bolts that didn't want turning and skinned his knuckles on something he couldn't name. He climbed in and tried the ignition. A click. Then nothing. Then a grinding cough that died before it caught. He tried it again and again. He tried it until the click went flat and the dashboard lights dimmed, and then he made himself stop because he knew the sound of a battery giving up, even if he didn't know the sound of anything else under that hood. He sat with his hands on the dead wheel. "Okay," he said. The word had stopped meaning anything. He kept saying it anyway. Stop 3. The road. He filled a thermos from a few of the water bottles and began walking west, the way he'd been going, because west was where the hills were, and hills meant towers, maybe, somewhere. He held the phone up every few minutes. The screen showed the same two words. The asphalt threw the heat back at him from below, while the sun pressed it down from above, and the shimmer ahead never resolved into anything, just more road, more scrub, more nothing pretending to be something in the wavering air. He walked until his shirt clung to his back. Then he checked the time and the water in the thermos, and he turned around. No car had passed. Not one. Not going his way. Not coming back. The RV waited where he'd left it, small and white and useless against the brown. He sat on the step in the wedge of shade it threw, and he drank his careful measure, and he understood that the plan was finished. There were no more stops. He'd done the things a man did, and the things had done nothing. There was only the day now, and the day was long. He'd never had a day with nothing in it. He found this out slowly. He sat in the shade, and there was no phone to check, no radio worth the battery, no route ahead of him with a clock at the end, no package to hand across a threshold, no threshold. He turned his hands over in his lap and looked at the skinned knuckles and didn't know what to do with the time, and the time kept coming anyway, minute after minute, with nothing in it but the heat and the light and the enormous quiet. And in the quiet, she came. He didn't call her up. He'd have stopped it if he could. But the silence had a way of filling itself, and what it filled with was Sarah, standing in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table.
I feel like I'm married to a man hiding behind glass.
He'd looked at her hands. He remembered that. He'd looked at her hands and not her face, because her face had too much in it.
I listen, he said now, to the scrub, to the hawk that wasn't there anymore. I always listened.
But that wasn't what she'd said. She'd said he didn't really listen, and there was a difference, and he'd spent 15 years pretending there wasn't. He heard everything. He heard the catch in her voice, and the dishes set down a little too hard, and the long breath before she started a sentence she'd been holding all day. He heard all of it. He just never knew what you were supposed to do with it once you'd heard it. So he held still. He waited for the moment to pass. And the moments passed, one after another, year after year, until there were so many of them stacked up behind the glass that she couldn't see him through it anymore. The sun moved. The shade shrank. He moved with it, dragging himself around the side of the RV like the hawk's shadow tracking the ground. The nursery came next. He didn't want the nursery. He stood up to get away from it, and there was nowhere to go. They'd painted it a pale yellow, because yellow worked for either one. That was what the can had said, works for either. And he'd taped the edges, and she'd done the rolling. And for one afternoon, they'd been happy in a way he could still feel in his hands. Then the years went by, and the room stayed yellow and empty, and they stopped going in, and eventually she closed the door, and he'd been relieved about that too. Relieved the way he was always relieved when a thing went quiet. He'd told himself the closed door was peace. It hadn't been peace. He saw that now, with the desert holding still all around him and refusing to let him look away. It had been a grave they'd both agreed not to dig up.
I kept the peace, he said.
The words went out into the flat air, and the flat air took them the way the gravel had taken the fluid, without a sound, without a trace. He'd kept nothing. He'd buried things and called it keeping. He'd hidden behind the glass and called it quiet, and called the quiet peace. And one morning he'd packed in the dark to avoid her face, and driven into a place where there was no one left to hide from. The sun dropped toward the ridge. Joseph sat against the warm metal with his knees up and his arms around them, the way a boy sits, and the thing he'd been out running for 2 days, for 2 years, for 20, came across the open ground and sat down with him. It had no shape. It was just weight. It pressed on his chest until his breath came short and his eyes burned, and he pushed the heels of his hands against them hard enough to see colors, and a sound came out of him that he didn't recognize and couldn't stop. He cried the way a man cries who has forgotten how, badly, in pieces, with long silences in between where he thought it was over, and then it wasn't. When it finished, he was emptied out. The light had gone soft and low. The hills had given up their gold and gone purple at the base, and the sky behind them held that deep blue with weight in it, and the heat had lifted so completely that the first cool touched the back of his neck. He felt scraped clean and hollow and very far from anything. That was when the desert moved. A shape stood out where there had been nothing. East of the RV, maybe 40 yards, where the scrub thickened toward a low rise, a man, still, watching. The fading light caught the gray of a beard and the pale of sun-bleached clothes, and for a long moment Joseph couldn't tell if he'd conjured it out of the empty air the way he'd conjured Sarah. He got to his feet. His legs didn't want him. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there at the edge of the world with the dusk coming down around him, weathered into the color of the land. Watching Joseph the way the land itself had been watching him all day.
"Hey!" Joseph called. His voice cracked from the crying in the dust. "Hey, you got a phone? A truck? Anything?"
The man said nothing.
"My engine's dead. I need—" Joseph stopped. He didn't know what he needed. The list was too long, and none of it was anything this silent shape could carry. "I need help," he finished, and the words came out smaller than he'd meant them.
The figure tilted his head. A small motion, the kind you'd give a stray that had wandered up to you. Then he turned and walked back into the scrub, unhurried, sure of his footing in the failing light, and the desert closed around him until there was only the rise and the dark coming down over it, and the first star pricking through above. Joseph stood by the RV with his hand half raised. He couldn't follow. He didn't know the ground, didn't know which way the man had gone, didn't have the light or the legs or the nerve. And he couldn't go back inside and pretend he hadn't seen, because he'd seen, and the seeing had changed the shape of the night. He was not alone out here. He didn't know whether that made it better or worse, and standing in the cooling dark with the stars coming out one at a time over the place where the man had been, he understood that he was about to find out, and that there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chapter 3. The Twist. The hermit came back the next morning, before the heat. Joseph woke to a sound that wasn't the silence, a boot on gravel. He sat up fast, his heart going, and through the window he saw the man crossing the open ground from the east with the low sun behind him, a jug in one hand, moving at the pace of someone who had never once in his life needed to hurry. Joseph came out and stood by the step. The man stopped a few yards off. Up close, he was older than the dusk had let on, the skin of his face folded and brown and worked over by years of sun, his eyes a clear, pale gray that didn't match the rest of him. He set the jug down in the gravel between them.
Water.
The man said.
Yours won't last.
I've got...
You've got 2 days if you sit still and don't sweat. You've been sweating.
He nudged the jug forward with the toe of his boot.
Take it.
Joseph looked at the jug, then at the man. There a town? A phone? Anything out here?
Fort Davis is the closest with a man who can fix that.
A tilt of the head toward the RV.
Day's walk. More for you.
No insult in it. A fact. Set down like the water. You got a truck?
I don't go in.
At all?
The man didn't answer. He lowered himself onto a flat rock at the edge of the gravel, slow, his knees telling on him the way Joseph's did, and he looked out at the flats going gold with the morning and seemed content to sit there and look at them, as if Joseph and the dead RV were just 2 more features of a landscape he'd long since made peace with. Joseph picked up the jug. It was heavier than he expected. He set it inside the door and came back and stood there, the silence stretching, and because he'd never been able to bear that kind of silence with a person in it, he filled it. I'm Joseph. The man nodded at the flats.
You live out here? By yourself?
I do.
How long? The man worked his jaw, the way you do when you're counting something you stopped counting years ago.
Long enough that I had to think about the answer.
Joseph lowered himself onto the RV step. The metal was still cool. Why?
He didn't expect anything. The man had given him nothing but facts and water. But the old man kept looking at the flats, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, gone flatter, careful, the voice of a man stepping around something on the floor.
Had a family once. Wife. 2 girls.
A pause.
Coming back from her mother's up near Pecos. A truck crossed the line. I was at work.
He said it the way you'd read it off a page you'd read 1,000 times.
I wasn't even in the car.
The morning held still.
All 3, Joseph said. Not a question. He didn't know why he said it.
All 3.
Joseph looked at his own skinned knuckles. He didn't know what you were supposed to do with a thing like that once you'd heard it. He never had. But the desert wouldn't let him hold still and wait for it to pass, so he made himself ask.
How do you... He stopped, started over. What do you do after that?
The man turned his head, and the clear gray eyes settled on Joseph for the first time.
2 roads.
He said.
I sat in that house a year and let it take me down one of them. Came out here to finish the job, truth be told.
He looked back at the flats.
Didn't finish. Sun came up the second morning over those hills, and I was still here to see it. So I stayed to see the third.
Something turned over in Joseph's chest. The same nameless thing the first star had turned the other night. He'd come out here a victim. That was the word, though he'd never have used it. A man things had happened to. The marriage had collapsed the way a roof collapsed, under a weight nobody chose, and he'd loaded the RV and driven off to grieve a loss that fell on him out of a clear sky. But the sky hadn't crossed the line and killed anyone. There was no truck. There was only a man at a kitchen table who looked at his wife's hands instead of her face for 15 years. Whatever he'd lost, he'd had a hand in losing it. And the man in front of him had lost everything, all of it, with no hand in it at all, and was still here to set down a jug of water and watch the morning come. The unfairness of it opened under Joseph like a hole.
My wife's alive, he said. The words came up before he could weigh them. Sarah. She's alive. She's home. He laughed, that wrong laugh again, more breath than sound. I left her. I packed in the dark so I wouldn't have to see her face, and I drove out here to feel sorry for myself.
The man said nothing. He let Joseph go.
She used to put her hands flat on the table. Joseph stared at the gravel. When she had something to say, and I'd look at her hands. 15 years I looked at her hands and waited for her to give up and go to bed. And she'd give up, and I'd sit there after and tell myself I'd kept the peace. His voice was coming faster now, the thing pouring out of him, and for one bright moment it felt like a wound draining clean. I drove her off, slow, one quiet night at a time. She didn't leave me. There was no truck. I went behind the glass and I never came back out. And one day there was nothing left on the other side to come out to.
He stopped, breathing hard. He waited for the lightness to come, the relief that was supposed to follow a thing finally said out loud. It didn't come. What came instead was the picture of all those nights stacked up, every closed door and swallowed word, and the certainty under it like bedrock that he had done this with his own 2 hands, slowly, on purpose. The way you build a wall, brick after brick, telling yourself the whole time you're only keeping the peace. The relief curdled. What was left was worse than the silence. It was the weight of 2 days ago come back doubled, and it pressed the breath out of him, and he put his face down toward his knees.
I wasted it, he said into his hands. I had her, right there, and I wasted the whole thing being too scared to open my mouth.
The man was quiet for a long while, the kind of quiet that had room in it.
A man spends his whole life afraid of losing everything.
The old man said.
Then he loses it, and he finds out how little he ever needed to keep breathing.
Joseph lifted his head. The man wasn't looking at him. He'd gone back to the flats, to the gold light moving up off the ground, and he spoke to that, and not to Joseph, the way he spoke to everything.
You think you failed her because you went quiet.
A pause, no longer than a breath.
But the desert never says a word, and it's the most alive thing I know.
The words went into Joseph and stopped. He'd spent his whole life ashamed of his silence. Sarah behind glass, his thought process alien, the man who never really listened. He'd carried it like a defect, a broken part in him that drove her off and would drive off anyone. And now this man, who had lost more in one afternoon than Joseph had lost in 20 years, sat in the most silent place on earth and called it the most alive. His quiet might have been worth something. That was the thought that took his breath. Not that he was broken, that he wasn't, that there had been something in him all along that might have been a gift if he'd only known where to set it down, and that he'd spent it instead on a wall and burned the rest of it being afraid. And now the door of the yellow room was closed, and Sarah's hands were 1,000 miles behind him on a table he'd never sit at again. You couldn't take it back. None of it. The wall was built. The years were spent. He had no words. For once in his life, the silence wasn't a wall he hid behind. It was just all that was left, because there was nothing he could say that would reach back across 20 years and unbuild a single brick. The man rose from his rock, slow, knees complaining.
Sun'll be high soon,
He said.
Stay in the shade. Drink the water.
He looked down at Joseph once more, and there was no pity in the clear gray eyes, only a kind of recognition. One man who'd sat in the hole, looking at another man down in it.
Third morning's the one that matters,
He said.
Then he turned and walked back east, into the scrub, unhurried, sure of his footing, and the heat shimmer was already starting to rise off the flats, so that before he'd gone 50 yards, the bottom of him began to waver and blur, and then he was gone, swallowed whole, and there was no proof he'd ever been there but the jug of water inside the door. Joseph slid down off the step and sat in the gravel with his back against the RV. The day climbed. The shade shrank toward him. He didn't move to follow it. He'd had his one life. He saw it whole now, laid out flat under the white sky. Every quiet night, every closed door, every moment he'd let pass, and he'd been too afraid to live a single day of it. And now it was spent, and he was a 55-year-old man sitting in the dirt at the edge of nowhere with a jug of a stranger's water and no road back to anything he'd thrown away. He had never felt so far down in his life. Chapter 4. The Epiphany. He didn't eat that day. He drank the stranger's water because his body made him, and he watched the shade swing around the RV and didn't follow it, and the sun went down behind the hills the way it had every evening, gold to purple to that deep blue with weight in it. He went inside when the cold came. He lay on the narrow bed in his clothes and waited for sleep, and sleep didn't come. It wouldn't come. He lay there with the dark pressing on the windows and the whole of his life pressing on his chest, every closed door, every swallowed word, the yellow room, Sarah's hands flat on the table. He turned on his side. He turned on his back. The silence in the RV was a different silence than the desert's, close and stale, and it gave him no room. Near midnight, he gave up. He sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, and then he stood because the walls had gotten too near, and he pulled the door open and stepped down into the night. The cold took his breath. He looked up to find his footing in the dark, and he stopped. He'd seen stars before. A man who'd lived his whole life under a porch light and a street lamp had seen the few that fought through, the handful you could name. He had never seen this. The sky was full, not scattered, full. From the black line of the hills in the west to the black line of the flats in the east, the whole dome of it crowded with light, layer behind layer behind layer, the bright ones close and the dim ones farther, and behind those a dust of others so faint and so many that the dark itself seemed to glow. And across the middle of it, shoulder to shoulder, a band of pale fire poured from one horizon to the other, thick in places, torn in others, brighter than he'd known the night could be.
The Milky Way. He'd read the words. He had never understood that they meant this.
He stood by the RV with his head back and his mouth open, and the cold air going down into him, and the weight on his chest. The thing he'd carried out here and doubled and could not put down, met the size of what was over him. It didn't lift. He waited for it to lift, and it didn't. But it changed. It got smaller, not gone, never gone. But set down somewhere, placed against all of that, 15 years of silence, and a closed yellow door, and a woman 1,000 miles away. Against this, against the dust of 100 billion suns pouring over a man, standing alone in the dirt, his whole life, his whole ruined, careful, frightened life. It was true, and it was real, and it had happened, And it was also one small thing under a sky that did not need it to be anything at all. His legs went out from under him, not a fall, a folding. He sat down hard in the cold gravel, and then he lay back, all the way back, flat on the ground with his arms out, and looked straight up into it. The ground held the last of the day's heat. It came up through his back, warm against the cold of the air, and he lay in the seam between them and looked up and let the sky have him. The desert never says a word.
He understood it now. He felt it come into him whole, the way the man's two lines had gone in and stopped. But this time, there was no shame under it, no bedrock of, "You did this." The desert said nothing. The stars said nothing. The flats around him, the creosote, the hills, the hawk asleep somewhere out there, the lizard under its rock, all of it silent, all of it asking nothing and explaining nothing and needing almost nothing to be. A little water, a little warmth, the turn of the day, and it was the most alive place he had ever stood inside of.
It didn't need to speak to be alive. And neither, then, did he.
The thought arrived without weight, the way the breakdown had, the way the first star had. He lay in the dirt and turned it over, and it held. His quiet had never been the broken part of him. The fear was the broken part. He'd taken the one true thing he had, the stillness, the listening, the long room inside him where he heard everything, and he'd been so afraid of it, so ashamed of it, that he'd walled it off and called the wall peace. And Sarah had stood on the other side knocking for 15 years on a door he was too frightened to admit was a door.
It had been a door the whole time. He saw the choice then, the one he'd put off in the dark 3 nights ago. Walk or wait. Run or stay. He'd told himself he'd decide in the morning, and he'd been deciding it his whole life. Always the same way. Always the one that let someone else come along and choose for him. He chose now. He chose to stay still, not the staying of a man waiting for a truck to come over the rise. He let that go, the whole machinery of rescue, the held-up phone, the eyes on the road. A man would come or he wouldn't. Fort Davis was a day's walk, and the water would last, and his legs would carry him when he was ready. And none of that was the thing anymore. The thing was the staying, to stop running from the silence and walk into it, to sit inside his own life with the door wide open and nobody coming, and find out that the open door was not a thing to be afraid of. He forgave the man at the kitchen table. It surprised him how it came, not as a decision, but as something that loosened on its own once he'd stopped clenching against it. The man at the table had been afraid. That was all. A quiet, frightened man who didn't know his quiet was worth anything, who'd never once been told it might be, who'd done the best a scared man could do and gotten it wrong for 15 years. Joseph lay in the dirt and looked up at the dust of the suns and forgave him, because the man was him, and because you could not unbuild the wall, but you could stop hating the boy who'd laid the bricks, not knowing what else to do with his hands. The weight didn't crush him now. He could breathe under it. He breathed slow, in through the cold, the night air clean and thin and tasting of dust and creosote, and out, and the sky didn't move and didn't care, and he found, lying there, that he didn't need it to. He thought about Sarah, and it didn't cut the way it had. He couldn't take it back. He knew that. He wasn't going to lie in the dirt and tell himself a story where he drove home, and the door opened, and the years undid themselves. The years were spent. The room was yellow and empty, and 1,000 miles behind him. But the man lying here was not the man who'd packed in the dark. That man had been certain he was broken. This one knew he wasn't, and there was a long stretch of life still ahead of him, however much, and a door in him that he finally knew was a door, and he could choose, for whatever was coming, to keep it open. That was a kind of hope. He hadn't expected hope. He'd come out here to grieve, and he was lying in the dirt full of it, against everything, hope, plain and quiet, under all that light.
His phone was in his pocket. He could feel the shape of it against his hip. Dead, dark, 2 days past its last signal. He left it there. He didn't reach for it. The thought of the bars in the corner, of the network out there waiting to pull him back into the route of his life, the deliveries, the thresholds, the careful voice, it had no pull on him now. The phone could stay dark. He found he didn't mind. The silence on the other end of it was not a loss. It was the first real quiet he'd ever let himself sit inside.
Out past the rise to the east, where the old man had stood and watched him and walked back into nothing, there was a figure carved from mesquite wood, small, set down in the scrub by a stranger's hand, for no one, for whoever came, waiting in the dark to be found or never found. And Joseph would never know it was there, and it didn't matter. The man had taught him the lesson without it. You made the thing, and you set it down, and you let the world have it. You gave without holding. You lived without being claimed. The cold deepened. The warmth came up from the ground into his back. Joseph lay in the seam of it, flat on the floor of the desert, and looked up into the river of suns pouring from hill to flat, and he didn't think about the morning, or the walk, or Fort Davis, or the man who might or might not come over the rise. He breathed. He looked. He was alive, a small, warm-breathing thing on the skin of an enormous, quiet world, under more light than he had names for. And for the first time he could remember, he wanted, with his whole chest, to see what the morning would bring. A star fell. A thin, bright line, there and gone, down the eastern dark. He watched the place where it had been. He smiled and kept looking up, and waited, without fear, for the next one.
You have just listened to The Distance, an audiobook short story written and produced by Original Worlds Audiobooks.
Thank you for listening. Copyright Original Worlds, 2026.